I'm going to go through about a 30-minute presentation. It'll be a combination of a few PowerPoint slides, and then I'm going to kind of do a quick overview PN3 demonstration so that you can kind of see how the software works, and we'll talk about how we integrate with Dynamics GP and Dynamics SL. And if you have any urgent questions, we can maybe post those through GoToMeeting, and Gary will let me know and we can get those answered. Otherwise, if we get to hold the questions after we wrap up the presentation, we'll open up the line for everyone and do a Q&A so that we can get all of your questions answered. So without further delay, let's go ahead and jump in, and I'll get the presentation started. What I'd like to talk about first is we've been doing these PN3 integrations with Dynamics GP and SL for quite a while, and so we kind of reach back out to our customers and really try to get an understanding of, what were some of the primary reasons why you did this, what are some of the benefits, what are some of the key features that you really had to have. And so I want to kind of share those with everyone this morning so you can see what some of your colleagues have done and what they're looking for, because in many cases we find other organizations are looking for very similar functionality. But the two things we hear more than anything else in terms of why organizations are looking to implement either both a purchasing and an AP automation tool or strictly looking for AP automation, they tell us over and over again that improving process efficiencies and improving their financial controls tend to be the two primary reasons. And so I want to talk about both of those in a little bit greater detail before we kick off the demonstration. From an efficiency standpoint, there tends to be some key features that we get asked for over and over again, and that we've therefore incorporated into our PN3 suite of products. Organizations are telling us, we really have to get rid of the paper in the process. So as we receive vendor invoices in paper form, we want to be able to efficiently scan those in. We also hear over and over again that the percentage of invoices that we're getting electronically is increasing every year. And so we want to have ways to deal with those electronic receipt of invoices very efficiently also. We also want to have ways to process expense reimbursements. So instead of using an Excel spreadsheet or a paper form, we'd like to have a way to do that. There also are cases in the organization where we need to request payment to a vendor, but we don't have an invoice. And we want to get rid of using Excel spreadsheets or paper forms for those processes as well. And so we're looking for an electronic check request form. And as I mentioned earlier, about half of our customers have also implemented our purchase authorization solution, PN3 for purchase requisitions, and they were looking for an electronic purchase request form. Also, from an efficiency standpoint, the thing we hear often is, our process is just a little more redundant than we'd like it to be. We have managers handwriting, coding, hand approving invoices, and routing paper throughout the organization. We want a tool that integrates with Dynamics GP or SL and allows managers to have access to our chart of accounts, and we can restrict their access if we need to, but they have the ability to code and approve online, and AP can review that versus having to do data entry from handwritten information. And I'll demonstrate that this morning. We also hear that we're constantly getting calls in the AP department trying to find out the status of payment of a particular invoice. And we'd like our users to be able to go into PN3, pull up a transaction, and see if that transaction has been paid. From a financial controls perspective, the first thing we hear is that we have internal purchase and payment authorization policies. We just want to make sure that we can build a workflow in PN3 that guarantees that our policies are being adhered to at all times. We also want to be able to track pending liabilities. In a paper environment, we had invoices that were throughout the organization. We didn't know who had them, where they were. Sometimes a vendor would call and we couldn't put our fingers on an invoice. And so we want to be able to, through reporting and other mechanisms, we want to know what's pending, what's out there, how has it been coded so far, because maybe we need to accrue it. So we want to know at a moment's notice what our pending liabilities are. In our purchasing module, the customers have said, it would be great if our managers could see real time the impact that their purchase decisions will have on their budget. So we'd love for them to be able to drill down and see that, and I'll demonstrate that this morning also. These next few slides are just a few organizations that have implemented our PN3 solutions to either automate both their purchasing and payment authorization processes, or strictly using PN3 as an AP automation tool. Enough for the slides, and we try to get that through very quickly to not put anyone to sleep, and we're going to now jump right into the demonstration. Again, if anyone has any questions so far, if you could maybe post that question in GoToMeeting, and if it's something that you can hold on to, we'll do a Q&A at the end of the demonstration and get any of your questions answered. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to log into PN3 just to facilitate some workflows. So you'll get a feel for how PN3 works. In this first example, I'm going to log in as an AP user, Pamela Hood, who's received an invoice in paper form that she'd like to get routed to a manager to get authorization to pay it. One of the things you'll notice right away is that PN3 is a web application. However, the vast majority of our customers elect to install PN3 on their servers, but their users have access to PN3 through a browser, so you don't have to load PN3 on a user's workstation. We do offer hosting if that's a preference, but again, the majority of our customers like to host their own software. In this first example, I'm logged in as Pamela Hood. Pamela's received an invoice in paper form that she'd like to get routed to a manager, Mary Jones, to get authorization to pay it. Pamela can scan, excuse me, a single invoice, or she can scan invoices as a part of a batch. I'm just going to scan a single invoice. So I'm telling PN3 I have a new invoice. It's going to ask me, do you have it in paper form? Do you need to scan it? Or would you like to import it? I have it in paper form, so I'm going to select Start Scan and scan this in. I have a small scanner connected to my laptop. So as soon as I hit Start Scan, it's going to scan this invoice in and create an image of the invoice. Everyone should now see an invoice on the screen from the vendor Productivity Incorporated. Pamela wants to route this invoice to a manager, Mary Jones. But she also wants to be able to track it. So Pamela's going to come into PN3 and she's going to select who the vendor is. This vendor data is coming from your active vendors in Dynamics GP or Dynamics SL. Pamela's also going to put in her invoice number. She can type in or select her invoice date from a calendar. She's going to put in the invoice amount. And she's going to tell PN3 that she'd like to route this invoice to a manager, Mary Jones, to get authorization to pay it. Pamela could also code the invoice at this point, or she could let Mary code it as a part of the approval process, which is what we'll do in this case. So when I hit Save and Upload, you'll see the screen refresh to confirm for me that this invoice was captured today by Pamela and was routed to Mary Jones. We then set up processes to automatically email staff when their action is required. So Mary will receive an email alert to let her know that there's an invoice in her PN3 task list that we need her to take action on. And if she doesn't take action in a timely manner, we'll send her a reminder as well. In a second, I'm going to log in as Mary to continue processing this invoice. But before I do that, I want to show you other ways that we can get invoices into the PN3 workflow. Instead of scanning one at a time, we have ways to scan as a part of a batch. Or I can go to a digital copier or a network scanner in my office, scan there, and then import them into PN3. We also have a credit card import process for our customers that are looking to streamline the validation of credit card charges by their staff. We have ways of importing American Express, MasterCard, or Visa charges and then routing them to the appropriate staff person to confirm and code those charges. We have a module called eCapture. Our eCapture module, our customers really like a lot because this allows them to set up an email address that they use solely for the receipt of vendor invoices. In many cases, it's called AP or accounts payable at their domain, and they will instruct vendors. Our preference is that you send invoices to us electronically as PDF files via email to the following email address. Once you do that, we will configure PN3 through the eCapture module to monitor that email address. And when any email comes in with attached documents, could be one invoice attached or 20 invoices attached, it will grab the invoice and route it to AP. So AP will not have to log into that account, save attachments, and then import them manually into PN3. PN3 does that automatically. It presents it to the user. In the setup, you can tell it based upon where the invoice is coming from, the email domain that it's coming from, we link that to your vendor. So we already know who the vendor is. We can even tell it where that vendor places their invoice number, invoice date, and invoice amount so that we can pull that off of the invoice to eliminate that data entry step. And so at this point, I didn't have to open up an envelope. I didn't have to scan an invoice. The process becomes a fully electronic workflow. And I can then simply select the manager that I'd like to route it to initiate the workflow. But as I mentioned, what I want to do now is I'm going to close out, and I'm going to sign out as Pamela, and I'm going to sign back in as Mary Jones, the user we routed the invoice to. As I mentioned earlier, Mary would have received an email alert. She's going to select a link in that email alert, and it's going to take her to the PN3 login screen. As soon as Mary logs in, her PN3 task list is presented. So this shows Mary that there are 3 invoices awaiting your action. The benefit of it being a web application is that Mary could be working from home, she could be traveling, she could be on vacation, but that's kind of a side joke. I'll talk about that later with one of the attendees. But you could be anywhere and you could be participating in this workflow. So Mary receives the invoice and says, okay, I'm going to take action on this productivity invoice. Mary opens up the invoice and she can see an image of the invoice. There's several options that Mary has at this point. If Mary receives this invoice and says, I'm not certain why this was sent to me, this isn't my invoice, it's not for my department, Mary can select route and route it back to AP and put in a note explaining why she's routing it back. Mary also has the option of rejecting the invoice, determining that it's not a valid invoice, and for whatever reason, she's not authorizing it for payment. If she selects reject, it will require that she put in a note explaining why she's rejecting the invoice, and it'll send it back to AP with that note attached. But Mary also has the option of approving the invoice, and also she can code it. In most cases, we have a business rule in that says you have to code it before you approve it. There are also many instances where we don't use that rule if the coding is going to be controlled by AP. But in this example, I'm going to code the invoice. And there are various ways that we can provide this coding dialog. In this example, I have a single field labeled expense account that has each of the segments of the chart of accounts. You also have the ability to restrict access to the chart of accounts using any of your segments or a combination of your segments if you don't want all users to have access to your full chart of accounts when they're coding. I'm going to create a single line of distribution, in this example, equal to the invoice amount, but there's no limit to how many lines of coding I can create. We'll just run a validation that the sum of the lines equals the invoice amount. I'm creating a single line of coding for $10,000 for this $10,000 invoice. And now Mary's going to approve the invoice. This is when your AP processes and procedures take over. In your PN3 setup, you have the ability to define what a manager's approval limit is. In this example, Mary has an approval limit of $1,000. So although we will let her permit her to approve the invoice, it's not considered fully approved because it's greater than her approval limit. So when Mary selects approve, this invoice will automatically route to her manager, Susan. If Mary's approval limit had been $10,000 or greater, it would have been considered fully approved and it would have routed back to AP. But in this example, it routes to Mary's manager as soon as she selects approve, and it presents the next invoice in Mary's task list automatically so that she can take action on the invoices in her task list one at a time. I'm going to sign out now as Mary, and I'm going to sign in as Mary's manager, Susan. Susan has received an email alert, and she's going to log into PN3 and see what the transaction is that's awaiting her action. It's the same invoice that Mary just approved. Susan, in addition to being able to see an image of the invoice, she can see in the invoice processing milestone that Mary has already approved the invoice this morning. As Mary's manager, she can also review and edit the coding if she feels that it wasn't coded correctly. At any point in the process, a user could attach a supporting document. We also have invoice notes functionality that would permit Susan to put in a note and send that note to Mary to get her question answered or to just make a comment. And they can get an electronic conversation going if they'd like to, and their conversation will be permanently attached to this invoice. So if I search for, and I'll show you the search functionality later, this invoice 3 months or 3 years later and pull this invoice up, I'll see not only who approved it and when, but I'll see any notes that were attached as well. I'm going to approve this invoice as Susan. Susan's approval limit is $25,000, meaning it will not have to route to Susan's manager. As soon as Susan approves it, it's considered fully approved, and it routes back to AP as a fully approved invoice. So what I'm going to do now is sign out as Susan and sign in as Pamela, Susan's manager. I'm sorry, Pamela, the AP processor. The invoice has returned to Pamela fully approved. It shows Pamela that Mary approved it and Susan approved it. It also shows the coding. Most of our deployments give AP the ability to do a final review of the coding to make sure it's correct before sending this transaction to Dynamics GP or Dynamics SL. We can also include in this workflow, you may say, well, before it goes back to the AP processor, there's a manager in accounting that I'd like it to go to review the coding before AP pushes it to Dynamics GP or Dynamics SL. The primary benefit at this point in the process is that you will not have to open up the voucher entry screen and say, now that I have this approved voucher, let me enter it into Dynamics GP or Dynamics SL. All you have to do as the AP processor, because it's fully approved, is hit approve. If the AP processor that you're logged in as has an open batch in GP or SL, it will put the invoice in that batch. If they don't, it will create a batch and put the invoice in that batch. And we work with you to come up with any rules or methodology that you like to use for batch creation. Some customers say, I'd like to create a batch every day. Other customers say, no, I keep batches open for multiple days, but I don't want to put any more than X number of invoices in any open batch. And so we can follow those rules for batch creation as a part of the PN3 process. So that kind of gives you a quick feel for workflow functionality. Again, this demonstration doesn't go into too much detail, but it gives you kind of an overview. I do want to show you additional transaction types in PN3. I mentioned it during the presentation. We also have what we call the PN3 electronic check request form. So if I need to request payment to a vendor, but I don't have an invoice, I can come in, I can select the vendor, I can fill out the check request form, save it, I can attach supporting documents, and I can submit that for approval. In most cases, the check request form workflow, instead of starting in AP, will start in your various departments with a user wanting to request payment to a vendor and sending it to the workflow, and then it's sent to AP after it's fully approved. Although the AP processor could start this process as well, but it would have to be fully approved before it could be sent to GP or SL. Last transaction type is expense reimbursement. So if you're looking for a tool to automate your expense reimbursement process, this electronic expense report form permits you to do that. Both of these forms, by the way, the check request form and the expense report form, can be customized. But it gives you a place to put in your transportation, mileage, lodging, meals, meals with guests, and other expenses. Save it, attach receipts and other supporting documents to it, and then submit it for approval. Once fully approved, it gets passed to GP or SL. And so this is a great tool to use if you're processing expense reimbursements through AP versus payroll. This becomes a very efficient way of doing that. All right, let's talk for a second about reports. You really want to have reports that help you manage the process. You want to make sure that you can see where everything is at a moment's notice, and the open invoices report is great for that. So this says, I want to see everything that's in the PN3 workflow that has not been fully approved and passed to GP or SL. I want to see how aged the transactions are. I want to see who the vendor is, invoice number, invoice date, invoice amount. In the last column, I'd like to see who the invoice owner is. By invoice owner, I mean whose PN3 task list is this transaction in, so I know who I need to reach out to. I do know already that PN3 is sending reminders to these users, but for whatever reason, the transactions are still there, and I want to monitor them and make sure that they're being approved in a timely manner. And I can view this online, export it to Excel, or print it out. If I'm curious how some of these transactions have been coded so far, because I may need to accrue some of these expenses, I can open up the accrual report, and it will show me my distributions and even summarize the distributions at the end to assist me in doing accruals if I need to do so. There may be times when I need to search for a transaction. I'm at my desk, I'm curious if an invoice has been paid, or I'm doing some research. Whatever it is, I can come into PN3 and search using any of these fields. I'm doing a search now using vendor name and invoice number combination, so I can do a unique transaction. I open that invoice up, and I can see the status of that transaction. I can see that it's been AP approved. It has the appropriate manager approvals. AP approved is my confirmation as a user that the invoice is in GP or SL already, because as soon as it gets AP approved, it's passed over. But I'm curious if the invoice has been paid. PN3 will copy from GP or SL the payment information as soon as you process the payment. So we can come here to see the method of payment, the payment number, and the payment date. So in the past, where your staff maybe had to pick up the phone to call AP to find out the status, they now go into PN3 and find out the status of your transactions. So that's a very quick workflow or very quick overview of some of the primary functionality in PN3 for payables. I want to go through a very quick workflow also in PN3 for purchase requisitions so that you can get a feel for how that works, because some of you may be interested in addition to an AP automation tool, a tool to automate your purchasing processes. So I'm going to log into PN3 for purchase requisitions, and we'll spend the next couple of minutes just walking through a quick workflow there. So I'm going to log in as Mary Jones, that same manager that approved an invoice earlier. But in this case, she's in PN3 for purchase requisitions. And she wants to submit a purchase request to get approval to order some items. There's two ways that she can do that. She can open up a blank form, and she can fill this form out, save it, attach supporting documents, and start the approval process. But she also has the ability to generate a new purchase request from an older PO, which I'm going to do in this case just for the sake of time. So Mary says, here's an older PO that I had. I've now generated a new purchase request from that, and I'm going to edit this to update it to have some of the fields that are more applicable to this transaction or this purchase request. So I can edit any of the fields in the form that I need to. It gives you 10 rows by default. I can add additional rows if the 10 is not enough. But I can fill my form out and then save it. I also have the ability to attach supporting documents if I need to. But what Mary's more interested in doing is coding it to see what impact this purchase would have on her budget. So Mary comes in and I'm going to create a line of distribution equal to my purchase request amount. So once Mary codes it, she now can drill down to see what impact this purchase will have on her budget. Shows her the budget, what's been committed against the budget already, what else is pending, and what her budget balance will be if all of her pending requisitions are approved. Mary decides that that's where she thought she was and she's ready to proceed, and she's going to approve this so that she can generate her purchase order. However, Mary's approval limit being $1,000, she can't generate her PO until her manager approves this purchase request. If Mary's approval limit had been greater than $10,500 or equal to, she'd be able to generate her PO right away. But in this case, when she approves it, it automatically routes to her manager, Susan. So let me sign in quickly as Susan so that Susan can approve this so that Mary can generate her PO. Susan would have received an email alert. She can log in. If Susan, after reviewing it, has questions, we have the same notes functionality. She can send questions to Mary and get her questions answered. But in this example, Susan says, I was anticipating this. I'm ready to approve it. Susan approves it. An email alert will go back to Mary letting her know that her purchase request has been approved because Susan's approval limit was greater than $10,500. I'm going to log back in as Mary. Can generate her purchase order. Mary selects Generate Purchase Order. PN3 assigns a PO number. I can even select Generate PDF and create a PDF of this PO and email that to the vendor. In most cases, the PDF will have your logo and your terms and conditions, and you use that to submit the order to the vendor. We also give staff the ability to receive against a PO to help AP in processing an invoice that comes in linked to a PO. So I have the ability, after I've received all or partial items, to come in and say, I ordered 10 and I received 10, or I received 5. Whatever I received, I can record this in PN3 to help AP when they're processing invoices against open purchase orders. Okay, let's do this real quick. I'm going to come back to the PowerPoint and just do a very quick review before we open it up for Q&A. So in our payable solution, we have efficient scanning and electronic receipt of invoices, electronic check requests and expense reimbursement forms, automated routing, email alerts and reminders, paperless coding and approvals, real-time invoice status, no paper to file, and online search and retrieval of invoices. We have electronic purchase requests. You can attach supporting documents to those as well. Automated routing, again, email alerts and reminders, paperless coding and approvals, budget integration, online receipt confirmations, as well as online search and retrieval of purchase requests and purchase orders. Thanks for bearing with me. I tried to get through that quickly. I hope I didn't go too fast. But let's, if we could, Gary, if we could open this up now for Q&A, I'd be happy to answer any questions that have come in.
We have multiple individuals that can approve invoices. So with this automatic routing, is there a way that if it normally goes to one person, someone else is able to approve it, that they're able to go look at it, or it's jointly shared some way amongst, say 2 or 3 different managers that all have approval authority?
An invoice might come in, and we have some customers that have said, I could send that invoice to 2 or 3 different people, and I really only need one of them to approve it. So when I route it, instead of routing it to one person, I want to route it to 2 or 3 people at the same time, and I'm only looking for the first one available to approve it. We can support that.
That's correct.
Yep, we can certainly support that. The other variation on that says, I want to route it to 2 or 3 people, but I need all of them to approve it. And so we can have the workflow set up that says you can either select first available and only one is required, or you can select all, and then all of the users you select are required to approve it before it's considered fully approved.
A person forwards or sets up a rule in Outlook, for example, that their email gets forwarded to another person, will these emails get forwarded as well?
They will not, Barry, but let me show you how we typically handle those types of transactions. So let's do this. I'm going to log in real quick. Everyone should still see my screen. I'm going to log in as this user, Mary Jones. Because users have the ability in PN3 to set up an out of office. So we can't, although we integrate via email with Outlook, we can't use the Outlook out of office. But a user can come into PN3 and say, I'm going to be out from this date to this date. And if something gets routed to that user, the system will automatically reroute it to their manager if they're away. Now, what happens in many cases is the last thing they're thinking about doing is going into PN3 and saying, I'm going to be away during this time frame. So we have functionality in PN3 that allows your PN3 administrator to reroute a transaction. So if you see in the open invoices report that Derek has an invoice he hasn't taken action on, we need to get it approved. Derek's on vacation, we can't reach him. The PN3 administrator can come in and say, I'm going to pull this from Derek's task list and route it to another staff person. Base PN3 application is doing authentication through PN3. However, many of our customers, and we do this quite often, we can automate authentication through Active Directory. What happens in those cases, if we sense who the user is based upon their network login, then the login screen in PN3 is not presented. We only present the PN3 login screen if they're not logged onto your network. And in that case, they would use their same network login and password to get into PN3. But if they are on the network, we pass it and let them in automatically. It's kind of a single sign-on, if you will. In the workflow, it seems that it's done by users and their amounts. Can it be done by vendor? You may want to go in and say, for vendor ABC, I want to set up a particular workflow rule for that vendor. And if that's what your question is, we do have the ability of creating what we call workflow templates. And so you can create a template and maybe call it that vendor name. And so when the invoice comes in, instead of routing it to a particular staff person, you select the template for that vendor name, and the workflow that you've set up for that template is the one that will be used.
On the electronic expense reimbursement form, now, we have a lot of people that fill those things out. How do they have access? I mean, not everybody's going to have access to PN3.
Well, if you want anyone that you want to participate in the PN3 workflow, meaning I want them to be able to fill out their expense report, then they have to have access to PN3 to do that. Now, let me make from a pricing methodology standpoint, one of the things we do is that if you have staff who their only thing that they'll do in PN3 is fill out expense reports and submit them for approval, we don't include them in your concurrent user requirements because all of them could be logged in at the same time, filling out their expense report, and they're not using a concurrent user license. So you can create a user ID for all of them, and they can go in every month or once or twice a year because they're not using a license when they go in. They're simply filling their report out and submitting it, and they can check on the status of their expense report, but that's really all they can do.
And those are electronically uploaded into Great Plains just like the invoices would be.
That's exactly right. We link their user ID to their Great Plains vendor ID, so when they're filling their report out, it defaults in their vendor information. They fill it out, it gets fully approved, it goes to AP for review, and it goes into GP just like any other voucher would.
So on the electronic submission of invoices, there are limits, are there not? As to how many vendors you can have on that?
No, Barry, that used to be the case. There's no limits now. You can set up as many vendors as you need to. There's no limit. It used to be the old pricing methodology said I can set up 100 vendors or 200 vendors. Now there's no limit to how many vendors you can configure.